Good. So, what are we talking about today, my friend?
John and Paul, as usual, and
Yep.
we're diving into fatherhood.
Something we're both familiar with, right?
Yeah, I got two sons. You have a son and a daughter, right?
I do. I do. And my son is, they're both Beatles fans, but my son particularly is as a musician, singer-songwriter is quite the Beatle fan.
My young son's quite a big Beatle fan as well. So we got that going for us. We did our jobs there.
Yeah.
So in terms of song title, you got anything?
Well, I always prefer that we use a Beatles song so it incorporates both. And I don't love this because in each case it's a little too gender specific for my taste, but I sort of have to default without going in the Beatles yet to Put It There by Paul off one of my favorite Paul albums, Pictures of Eight. And is that what it's called? Pictures of Eight? No.
No, no, you're thinking of the song "Figure of Eight," but
Right.
it's
Flowers in the
flowers in
Dirt.
the
I
dirt.
always screw that up. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Put It There, and then Beautiful Boy off Double Fantasy, which is, one of the greatest songs ever written, I think, about being a parent. But my daughter's named after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So that's not the right song for this, but I'd like to think there's a song, but it's interesting too. And maybe this is a good way to get into our discussion. And I obviously want to know what you think, but um, I don't think the Beatles were that focused about being parents from in that point of their life. I mean, they were, but I think that, as they got older, parenthood became more sort of part of their songwriting consciousness.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only one that I think could slip in there is pretty interesting would be Hey Jude.
Yep.
Because, for those who don't know, or the story goes that uh, Paul wrote that for Julian, basically. I think he was going out to visit John and Julian, and he knew that John was going through the divorce, I think, at the time. And so he was saying, it's going to be all right and all that. And uh, so, I mean, you could take that song many different ways. I think we also talked about how that's sort of like John thought that was a song to him. But yeah, that's interesting.
I think here's where we insert that great picture of Julian being on Paul's shoulders. Have you seen
Uh,
that?
oh God, I think so.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
great
yeah.
photo.
Well, and we'll get into it. I mean, I guess John used to say to Paul, like, how do you do that? Because Paul was pretty natural in playing with kids, and he would watch Paul play with Julian, and he asked him, he's like, how do you do that? And Paul's like, what do you mean? It's like you just get down there and get into it with them. But I don't know, maybe John shifted with his second son. So
Well, he definitely did. John, I have a question for you because you always know these kind of things. So, as we know of anyway, John Lennon had two children, right?
yeah, yeah, right,
Julian and Sean, with two different wives.
yeah.
Um, Paul has how many children? Do you
He
know?
adopted Heather, who
From Linda,
Linda
yeah.
had from a previous marriage, and then now he has four others. So three, Mary, Stella, and James with Linda, and then his daughter with Heather.
And of course, Stella is kind of famous in her own right for her fashion. But
Yeah.
it's interesting too because I was in an elevator. I've met Paul several times through work, but one day I was at the Mandarin Hotel. I think that's what it's called, or the Kahala, whatever the thing is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I was there to meet somebody, and the elevator stopped, and in walked Paul with like all his grandchildren. And it was a charming scene because it was an innocent, spontaneous meeting, and John didn't have that chance to be a grandparent. So again, just in terms of time going by, and even when I think of you and I met when we weren't even married yet. And now here we are 35 years later, or whatever it is, and we have older children, and the lessons that we've imparted to our children are I think integrated into our psyches are the Beatles. And I remember that when I had to fly to London, didn't have to, wanted to, or whatever the word is, to fly to London and meet with Paul McCartney, because as we've talked about on the show, I did the Super Bowl with him. And we had this meeting with him, and I kept remembering right before the meeting, keep your cool, don't be a fan. But the whole time that we were talking, I just kept thinking, I sing Golden Slumbers and Good Night to my children every night as a lullaby to get them to go to sleep. And then, years later, my son and I were screwing around one day doing some stuff on YouTube and or Instagram. I don't remember what it was for. And we did a duet of Her Majesty together. So like, the fatherhood aspect. I love this episode because I believe that my blueprint, and I imagine you're pretty similar, of being a parent, a lot of it starts with the sort of love and spirituality that and creative brilliance that came from the Beatles. I don't really parent my children the way Paul or John would, because I don't have that knowledge or that transparency. But one thinks they're probably, John ended up being a phenomenal parent, and Paul probably has always been one.
Yeah. It's a beautiful memories of those lullabies. I can recall with my younger son, Brett, he was born in 97, and that was around the time Paul's Flaming Pie had come out, which is one, I think, do you like that album?
I don't know that album as well. I think that period of McCartney is my least scrutinized period. What's on there besides Flaming Pie? I don't love that song.
It's got like The World Tonight. It's, kind of a rocker. The songs we were singing, Young Boy,
Yeah,
Beautiful Night.
that's my least. I'm very proficient, as you know, and I'm reading the Cosnin book now. So I can definitely talk about that. I'm very proficient with my Wings period, Paul, and my sort of chaos and creation forward, Paul. But there's a mid gap there that I kind of was off, Paul, and for better or for worse, Flaming Pie's in there.
Well, you may want to give that one a couple spins, because it's considered one of his latter day better albums, complete albums. So anyway, my son, I think he says he still kind of remembers, or maybe he just remembers me telling him about it, but I used to play that album and hold him and, just kind of like sing along with it. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it's a beautiful
it's
memory.
incredible. I mean, the other memory I have is that my son is a very, very good guitarist. He just is. And I play, but I'm not at all good. Like, my playing is the sort of learning of a chord, or the learning of like a box to solo in. But my son is intuitive. And I remember trying to play Blackbird forever and not being able to do it. And then about when my son was 12, he just came out and he sang and played Blackbird note for note. And he since performed that at a vigil that my wife's job for domestic abuse. And again, just that these two men, and this is one of the reasons we wanted to do these episodes, because they've influenced us in so many areas. We've talked about love, we've talked about collaboration. This one is probably, for both of us, I think, the most heartfelt, because I think that when I am done here on this mortal coil, as they say, and I'm asked to sort of evaluate what I did right and what I did wrong, I think when I say I exposed my kids to the Beatles, they're going to be like, yeah, you get the check for that one. That's good parenting.
Yeah. Well, I would say immerse them in it, really,
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And, just to kind of try to look at how did these guys operate as parents, and, sort of the downside and and maybe the upside is, so I think we referenced previously in another episode that John was kind of an absent father for Julian for a variety of reasons. And I think Julian still resents that to this day, as far as I know. Um, and I guess it was, it became uh, accumulated for him when he saw how John treated Sean. It was just such a contrast. And he's like, well, I can't even barely get a hug. Um, so now, of course, John was in New York, and I think Julian was camped in England. I don't know, when he got his career going, he might have spent some time in LA or something. But there was definitely that distance, and you can kind of understand it. But the thing about, just to touch on Paul, I I, I think he was a very hands-on parent. And I've heard that during the 80s, for example, it really, his kids were the priority. Like he would have recording sessions, and it would be pretty much like 10 to 5, 10 to 6. He's like, well, I'm going now, gotta get home for dinner, and hang out with the kids. And weekends were with the kids. And um I know that he purposefully sent them to what we would call public schools in America. Uh, and he just didn't want them to get like a big head of going to a private school. I've also heard that was tough on the kids, actually, because there was there was a lot of teasing and jealousy, I guess, that from their classmates. And so, yeah, who knows if that was the best choice. But like you say, Stella's very successful. Mary's got a photography career, now a directing career. James is a musician, and I think he works for MPL now. And so I'm not exactly sure what he does. But the last thing I'll say, that I remember Paul in a few interviews saying that they're not that worried about school too much, and like they would take the kids out and bring tutors when they went on tour and stuff. And he always said, what, I just wanted them to have a good heart. Like that was our most important thing. And of course, Linda was very uh, emotionally open. So I think that helped them. And so that is one thing I've tried to emulate, just intentionally, to some extent, with my kids.
So I'm going to sort of take this in a couple different directions, and you can pick it up wherever you want to go. On the one hand, when you were talking about Paul and his kids, I thought of this thing I heard David Duchovny, the actor and now novelist, once say, which is, his father said to him, son, the best thing I ever did for you is not become successful. And, the shadow, or the psychology of being the child of one of the most famous, if not the most famous person, and, the Bach or Beethoven of his generation, that's got to be crazy. So there's that thing I wanted to throw out there. The second thing I wanted to throw out there is, we talk about good titles for this, and, I think you probably have the winner with Hey Jude, but one song to me that's incredibly sad, and isn't probably right for this show in terms of a title, but is a very interesting look into parenthood from a negative point of view, is She's Leaving Home on Sergeant Pepper, which is, of course, a very, very not, it's a tough one, because basically it's two parents who are talking about how they essentially lost their child. And then the other thing that I was curious about is, we obviously both have fathers. Yours is living, mine is passed. But my dad, I loved my dad, but he never had any kind of interest that I was aware of in the Beatles. I never, so we talk about our kids, like I learned nothing about the Beatles from my father. And ironically, my father was working at the Deauville Hotel in 1964 when the Beatles were there and Ed Sullivan did his show there. And my dad was working there. So anyway, I've thrown 3 different things at you. You can run with whatever you want to run with.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. I wonder if he was able to hear some of it. Well,
Yeah, no, he went, and that's why when I ended up working with him, I thought it was kind of cool and whatever. But I, my dad didn't play the Beatles in the house. My dad didn't turn me on to, I found them on my own, exactly the opposite of the way we were talking about our own kids.
yeah. Yeah, with my dad, I may have mentioned this previously, but the thing I recall, he was kind of into the Beatles. I mean, he liked them, he respected them, but I remember I was like this naive 11 or 12-year-old, I think, and or maybe a little bit older, but I was sitting in my room and I was showing him, oh, I have this George album and this Ringo, and I was like, do you think the other guys are good too? He just kind of chuckled. He's like, oh yeah, you're good. You're gonna
You mean
like.
you started with, I mean, this is a conversation not of this episode, but you started with George and Ringo before the Beatles?
Yeah. I don't know why.
We'll have to talk about that another time, but okay.
Just turned out that way, but
That's
yeah,
not usually the gateway record. Sentimental
I
Journey
know.
or All Things Must Pass aren't usually the gateway record.
Yeah, I know. So, luckily he guided me toward the real good stuff. But yeah, I both my parents weren't huge Beatle fans. My mom was a huge Elvis fan, so that was kind of fun. But it's interesting you bring up She's Leaving Home for a couple of reasons. One, I don't know if you saw that clip of Patti Smith. They recently did a.
Yeah, my son went. We're talking about
Okay.
we were talking about kids. My son went to the Paul McCartney thing at Carnegie Hall last week.
Yeah, the music of Paul McCartney, and Patti Smith came out and did She's Leaving Home, and there's just a camera phone recording of it, but it's really powerful. And she adds a little poem at the end, and but the other thing about that song, I think, is, in a sense, you could say we all have to go through that song. Now maybe those characters felt like their daughter left sooner than they'd like, but you gotta let them go. And one of my all-time memories, which it's one of those you had to be there kind of thing, but for me, I can remember when our first son was born, Jeremy, and it was a long labor. Like, we didn't know what we were doing. We were at the hospital much too early. We were there like 24 hours before he decided to show himself. But so finally that night, we're exhausted, and I'm in some cot, and my wife at the time's in the bed, and Jeremy's in this little bassinet thing next to her. And maybe it was in the morning, actually. She was still coming off the drugs and everything, but I remember thinking and then saying to her, it's so interesting. Like, he's ours, he's our son, our love. But look at him. He's in his own space. He's his own individual too, and I know that's like obvious, but it just hits you in a certain way when it's your kid, I think. And I would say that's the dilemma or the challenge of every parent is to obviously be there for them, but at the same time show them how to be independent.
Well, I agree. And I want to go back a little bit to the songs because, I can be super critical of Paul because I think he's put out a tremendous amount of crap, but he's also put out some of the best music that we've ever heard ever. And what I think is so compelling is that She's Leaving Home. When I first heard that song, it broke my heart because that is a song where two parents, and I mentioned this earlier, are really it's kind of a referendum of how kind of clueless they were in terms of I mean, it's heartbreaking, that song. That is just a devastatingly heartbreaking song. I mean, the harp is great and but like and then you have Hey Jude, which is also one of the best songs ever written, which is just so incredibly uplifting. And it's just a real insight into the brilliance of the lyrics of because, I mean, they're Lennon McCartney tunes, but one gets the feeling. I don't know with She's Leaving Home how much balance there is, but Hey Jude clearly was a Paul
Oh
song.
yeah. Yeah.
And so it's just I
Well,
just
yeah, and there, my partner and I were commenting on this the other day because we were watching that Patti Smith clip together. And by the way, at the end of her, when she does her little poem at the end that she adds in, her last line is something like, I left you to find myself, you know. Um, so, you know, I well, they're so those guys were so young when they wrote that, and it's such a mature kind of idea. Yeah, and that's what blows me away. But yeah, you can really get me going on that song. 'Cause I think there's so many dimensions to it. When I heard the Patti Smith version, I really heard because she kind of like acts it out a little bit, which is cool. And I heard the martyrdom of the parents, they're kind of,
yeah, they're feeling
you know,
sorry for
yeah, they're
themselves.
feeling
Yes, for
sorry for
sure.
themselves, and
They're
the
not
kid,
likable people. They're not
yeah,
likable people.
the kid just wants to go live her life,
Yeah, you should have paid more attention to your kid.
Yeah, yeah,
Never a thought for ourselves. It sounded like they didn't do a whole lot of listening as parents.
yeah. They probably
I think
somewhat
being a parent
tuned out.
requires a skill that I'm not very good at, which is listening.
Mm, mm,
Your kids, I feel that especially as they get older, sometimes all they want you to do is listen.
yeah,
And that song is about two parents who were not paying attention.
yeah, yeah. That's so true, and I'm I'm learning more about that all the time, really. You know, whether it's with my kids or my love partner, like, and I can see it for myself. I don't want advice most of the time, I do, but I, like you say, there's something powerful about just being heard and received.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Uh,
Were you saying something? No, I'm kidding.
it's like, I was thinking of something else, John.
I got a funny story for you, but I don't want to interrupt you if you're still making your point.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I got to do this, even though it's like not about fatherhood, but since the title of today's episode is going to end up being Hey Jude. So this is just, a story. I don't even know if I've told you this, but I probably have. You've heard all my stories, but as it relates to Hey Jude, we, myself and the producer of the Super Bowl, we flew to London and, we had a meeting with Paul and we were sitting with him and a couple people who work for him. And he was going through the show, and the Super Bowl set list was Get Back, Drive My Car. I think Drive My Car was first, Live and Let Die, and Hey Jude. And part of that meeting was he wanted to end with Live and Let Die, and we changed his mind to end with Hey Jude. But he wanted to do a card stunt, which is when, the audience. Have I told you this story before?
I think so. Keep going.
All right. Well, anyway, so that he wanted every member of the audience at the Super Bowl to hold up a card that had nah, nah. And for Hey Jude. And he got called out of the room. And these two guys that were working for him wanted to make sure he was out of earshot. when they asked this question. So they careen their heads around the corner just to make sure. And they said, is Na spelled N-A or N-A-H? And I had, grown up on the Beatles 1967 to 70 Blue album with the lyrics, and I'm like, it's N-A, and they're like, right, because Na would be New Zealand, and we're not New Zealand. I just thought that's just a funny aside from Hey Jude.
NAH would sort of be saying like, no, like,
Right,
nah.
exactly. But it's, that's my Hey Jude.
That's like a Ruddles.
Yeah, exactly.
episode.
Ruddles, great album. Yeah,
I was just listening to that the other day too.
And that album is so good that some of those songs could actually have been Beatles songs.
Oh, absolutely.
Number One. I love that song. Number One. I do my radio show, and I have played the Ruddles before. So yes.
Oh, nice.
But that's because Eric Idle loves them so much. So yeah, I mean, it's there's so much here.
Let's talk a little bit about their childhoods. We've touched on it briefly before, but so John's father left him early, and then his mother was tragically killed when he was a teenager. Paul, his mother died, I think, when he was 14. He has spoken very fondly of his father. Apparently, his father was very attentive and
was a musician. Was a professional musician,
very supportive. Paul has one sibling, Mike, and I think they, had a pretty nice relationship. And he has talked about how he could contrast his upbringing with John's, and so some of John's hardness, it's not just accident. It's because of how he was brought up, and I think Paul wanted, definitely to create that warm family atmosphere that he remembered from Liverpool. And I think we're getting ready to wrap up, but just a couple other things I'm remembering. Have you ever seen Paul or listen to the podcast when he's on this show called Desert Island Discs?
No.
So it's a thing that's a long running thing in Britain. And he did his way back in like 81, 82, right around Tug of War. And one of the songs he picked, you can only pick like 5 songs, was Beautiful Boy. And there's still a video out there. They play the song and they sort of just, they put the camera on the guest and you could see Paul's quite emotional about this. And I think something touched him pretty deep that John maybe accessed that vulnerable side of himself to, in his relationship with Sean. And the other thing I remember is, do you know that song So Bad from?
I love that song.
Okay. So, it's like, I love her so bad. I love her. And then he switches it to, she said, I love him so bad. And he says, cause he was singing that song to his kids. And like, when he would say, I love her so bad, it would be well received by the girls, but he felt bad for James. So that's why he slipped in that, so he could say, I love him so bad too. So anyway, that's just a nice little thing. And so that's about all I have. We got anything else?
No, I'll just end with this, like it's a gift that keeps on giving. And in this new generation of our kids, the other thing that we lose sight of is we grew up, you talked about the George and Ringo albums. We grew up on albums. And I don't know about your kids, but my son listens to a lot of music, but the album isn't necessarily the way they kind of listen to stuff. And so there's music that, as much as my son likes certain artists, like an example would be, he loves the Hunky Dory album by David Bowie, But like, if I'm like, have you ever heard Low, or have you ever heard Scary Monsters? Like, he just might not. So there's this opportunity to keep turning my kid and probably yours on, and they turn us on. And one of the things that recently happened to my son, who, as I mentioned, is a huge Paul McCartney fan, went to the music of Paul McCartney at Carnegie Hall, loves Paul. He had never heard Daytime, Nighttime Suffering before.
Oh,
And we love that song, right? That's our
yeah,
favorite underrated Paul
yeah.
McCartney song. So I guess what I'm saying as we
Wait,
close
when did
is
you play it to him? When did you?
a couple weeks, a month ago, you know what I mean? Like, not
Was he
long
like
ago.
blown away by it?
Yeah. And I'm like, you've never heard this song? So like, I guess my point is, like, our job as fathers, they kind of still continue to this day, obviously, on a number of fronts, but there's still this opportunity. He had just, so for instance, when Plastic Ono Band was reissued, which is a phenomenal record, he just, he's like, oh my God, like that song, like, and it's just it's a great thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm right there with you, and you're reminding me too. One of my, I say this kind of ironically, but I think it's a great accomplishment as a parent. I was listening to my Back to the Egg album. This was back when my son was living with me, and it was skipping in parts, but I was just still listening to it, and all of a sudden he comes in, and he's carrying his Back to the Egg album. He's like,
That's
"Hey,
cool.
Dad, you want to you
I
put
love
this."
that story.
And
love that
that made
story.
me think, like, wow, I've really done my job. Like, we're not talking about Band on the Run, we're talking about Back to the
Yeah.
Egg. But yeah, I think bringing Beatles into the life, and the music of John and Paul into the life of your kids, and the values that, whether they live them or not, but the values that they espouse in their songs, you can't go wrong there, I don't think.
So I'm going to close with this. And if you want the last word, take it. Otherwise, we could close with this. Because we don't have rights to music, I want us to now just in our heads hear that horn section at the end of Arrow Through Me on that album, because my son loves that song. Bum, 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 bum,
Yeah.
bum.
Yeah, it's killer, and it's all done on keyboards, as far as
Peace
I
and
know.
love, buddy.
All right, peace out. All right, see ya.